Welcome to today's event on defending cyberspace through diplomacy with Perry Worldhouse Visiting Fellow Ambassador Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar and one of our former visiting scholars, Duncan Hollis. They are two of the world's leading experts in the development of international law and norms around the issues of cybersecurity, and we could not be more honored to have them joining us today. Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar is Ambassador at Large for Cyber Diplomacy at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She started this work just over 2 years ago as Estonia's first cyber ambassador. Previously, she was head of cyber policy coordination at the European External Action Service, where she kickstarted extensive European Union capacity building in cyber. She's also worked as a cybersecurity policy advisor to NATO, where she drafted and negotiated the first comprehensive NATO cyber defense policy in 2011. She is joined today by Duncan Hollis, the Laurel H. Carnell Professor of Law at Temple Law School and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His scholarship engages with issues of international law, interpretation, and cybersecurity, with a particular emphasis on treaties, norms, international organizations, and other forms of international regulation. Thank you both for taking the time today to join us for this important conversation. Hope you'll join me on stage now, and we look forward to hearing your engagement.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be back. I was a visitor last year at Perry Worldhouse and can attest to what a great place it is. Ambassador, or Heli, as I know you, because we go back a fair ways, and maybe we can even talk about how that's not too strange for cyberspace. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you visiting us here in Philadelphia virtually. I thought I'd start off, if I might, with a question about Estonia itself before we talk about you and your work. You know, for viewers that don't know, can you talk a little bit about why Estonia is considered one of the most wired nations in the world? Like, what does that mean? In what ways do information and communication and technology companies play a role in the daily life in Estonia that we might not know about?
Thank you, Professor Horowitz, and thank you, Professor Hollis, or Duncan. I would like to call you Duncan because we have been working together for more than 10 years, and the cyber community is so small, so we are all friends in this small cyber community we have. I would like to start maybe about giving an overview what actually has been going on in Estonia already for 2 decades. Estonia, I think, was one of those early adopters of technology, and we have already more than 10 years ago enjoyed thousands of government services online. So we have the national ID card. I'll show you mine. So you have here my picture is here, and name and date of birth and some other numbers. It's like a driver's license in the US. We call it national ID card. And here on the back of the ID card, you have a chip here. So you put your chip into the computer, you have your personal PIN number, and this personal PIN number is your electronic signature. So with this kind of electronic signature, you can access this. The only services you cannot access offered by the government would be getting married, registering birth certificate, and registering death certificate. But if you would like to use the taxation agency services, or you would like to use data from the motor vehicle department type of services, or any other government service, you can actually access with this technology. And interestingly, almost every Estonian has this ID card and uses it as well. So it's not just hypothetical, theoretical construct. We actually use it. There is a small percentage of the people who do not use it, like maybe smaller kids and also very old people. But people up to 80 years, my mother-in-law's case, 83, they are using all these technological gadgets and stuff here. So, and I think that possibly something that has set Estonia apart from the rest of the world, since we have started to use this kind of online services already almost 20 years ago. And e-banking and all this was here emerging in mid-90s. Now all the other parts of the world are using it as well. So it's not so new anymore for all the advanced world. But I think we were early adopters, and now we have seen also the hiccups in the road. So in a way, we are like a small experiment here, and some of those lessons have been useful for the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, I think having had the pleasure of visiting Tallinn several times and seeing how the kind of the e-government and citizenship and all of these other public services are conducted through online means, it's pretty impressive. But I wonder now if you could tell us a little bit more about your current job. You and I have known each other for a while, but you are now Estonia's ambassador for cyber diplomacy. What's that job entail? What are the key priorities or the key challenges that keep you busy during the day?
So, as many cyber diplomats, we are dealing with cyber stability, cyber norms, implementation of cyber norms, existing international law, and confidence building measures. We have now many different working groups and fora where we discuss cyber issues among the diplomats in different international organizations, United Nations, NATO, European Union, OSCE, and different other organizations where all these organizations have their own cyber processes. I must actually maybe go back a bit to Estonia, because when I started cyber business in Estonia, or when I, as a national security policymaker, happened to be part of this process here, there were no international cooperation mechanisms in 2007. So in a way, Estonia has been one of those front runners and promoters for more international cooperation and understanding between the nations. And also, we were the early nation calling for certain stability framework so that there is a normative behavior for the state behavior in this space. And now we are quite glad to see so many different initiatives and processes in different organizations. So, and as cyber ambassadors, we also have relations with other countries' cyber ambassadors. So we talk to the United States, to the United Kingdom, France, Germany, so on, Australia, so all the other countries in the world, which also are active in this field. So I think this is quite important. And interestingly, Estonia is also quite famous amongst how I think we would call it global south, or maybe technologically less advanced nations, which are coming to Estonia to learn from our experience and our different parts of the e-governance system, but also cybersecurity system. So I think this also takes up quite a lot of time from me and my team. I also have a team, of course.
Yes, no, and I think, yeah, it's remarkable. I think for many people, it's surprising to know, first of all, that there's a cyber ambassador from a country like Estonia, but then to realize that there are now dozens. I think I was talking to Chris Painter, who was one of the first people to hold the U.S. role, and he says there's now more than 20 diplomats who are doing this full time. So you've talked a little bit about the positive, how much the information communication technologies have impacted Estonia and allowed it to kind of, as you said, experiment and pilot new ways of engaging in the public space. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the threats, though. So what are the key challenges that you see, big picture or on your immediate kind of worry list? What are the things that you think are the most serious threats in cyberspace right now? I don't know whether you think election interference or some of the things we're seeing around COVID in hospitals or the healthcare sector?
I think certainly during this pandemic, I think we have seen very worrying trends of criminal attacks against the hospital and malware attacks against even the surgery or operation rooms, which has resulted in some loss of life, as we have heard from Germany. So I think this is really serious, and we should condemn it as all of us, as not only cyber community, but all humanity. But of course, when we look at the trends in cyber threats, then we also see quite sophisticated attack vectors by state actors and also by proxies. And somewhere there is a triangle of state actor, a cybercrime group, and a proxy group helping both actors in terms of somehow improving the skills of cyber attacks. And I think this kind of large organized crime groups that might be also doing this just for revenue and profit, they might be the most dangerous players right now, because when it comes to nation states, they know that they should be bound by international law, and there is a certain procedure already in place how the other nation states would call them out and so on. But the large criminal groups certainly do not have those boundaries, and they do not possibly also overthink the results and consequences. So I think this is something which might be the most destructive right now.
So it sounds like, in terms of the things that you see as the threatening, it's the actors that worry you as much as what those actors might do with malware or other tools. Is that fair? Because I think you're right. Like, I think the Dusseldorf case, you referenced that case in Germany where you had a hospital that was hit by ransomware, and they had to reroute a woman who was on the way to the emergency room there, and she ended up dying before she got to the new hospital. So, it may be one of our first kind of concrete cyber fatalities. Obviously, now that we're talking about that sort of lethality, it sounds to me the big worry you have is these kind of proxy actors that can do the bidding of states without necessarily being states themselves. Is that fair, or are there particular types of cyber attacks or cyber operations that worry you the most?
There are certainly those malware attacks that we have seen also organized by state actors, and we saw this in 2017 with WannaCry and NotPetya, when many of European countries had experienced very serious difficulties and huge economic loss. So this has been there, yes, and I think we all reacted to this. Yes, it has of course taken time before we all have been able to attribute those attacks properly and then have political agreement, do something collectively about it, and so on. So in a way, yes, we are not there yet with cybersecurity. It's not so mainstream, the foreign policy issues, as other fields. So we are still, I think, in a process of mainstreaming it. But yeah, we have done quite a lot of progress in the last 5 years specifically.
So thinking about like cyber diplomacy then, right? Do you think that what's the role of the cyber diplomat, whether it's your role specifically or cyber diplomats writ large? Is it to deal with these threats directly? Is it to highlight the threats for others to take action? Or so how can cyber diplomacy help us deal with this kind of range of cyber threats we've been describing?
Well, diplomats mostly are still, of course, dealing with other countries and other states. So we are of course coordinating all sorts of different other activities in other domains when it comes to cybercrime, when it comes to resilience issues. And there are other agencies in our nations that are in charge there. So we, as the diplomats, we are facilitating negotiations in the United Nations and other organizations about state behavior and desired state behavior in cyberspace. So this kind of normative framework or stability framework we have been developing in the United Nations First Committee, for instance, how we mainstream this, how we make it implemented, how we are also promoting the understanding about this, so that it's not just a few countries in the world who understand the processes in the cyber norms, but also the other countries and also the larger society would understand it. Because I think we are still in the beginning with this process, and sometimes some diplomats would compare the cyber norms or cyber normative behavior with the same new technologies as we, for instance, saw with nuclear technology emerging. But the issue with cyber is that we do not have time here. Wait for 30 years until we have some sort of agreement between the governments. We should react a bit more quickly. That's why the implementation of what we already have is very important. And as diplomats, we are now working towards the implementation of those norms and the understanding of how international law applies and the implementation of confidence building measures. Because we have this already established. The question is about how we implement it and how fast we implement it.
So yeah, and I think you said that also at the outset, that that the key parts of your job I hear are working on international law, working on norms, working on confidence building measures, and then mainstreaming all of that in some way. Maybe we could talk about each one a little bit separately. I wonder, first of all, if we could talk about international law. So as an international lawyer, I was thrilled in 2019 to see the UN General Assembly in a resolution endorse the work by the UN First Committee and the group of governmental experts that international law applies in cyberspace. Can you talk a little bit about why that affirmation was so important? Like, first of all, maybe for some people it might be surprising that it was even debated that international law applies in cyber, but can you talk a little bit about why it was important to have that agreement that international law applies, or what role from Estonia's perspective international law can play in regulating, cybersecurity and cyber threats?
One of our former presidents said that the national law is a nuclear weapon of a small country. So, and that's why the smallest states mostly, and I think majority of the countries in the world are smaller states or medium-sized states. They need the rules. They need some normative elements there for state behavior. And because rules-based world order is something that has helped us after the Second World War to grow into this kind of global society as we are here, and we should really be able to preserve that. So the more philosophical part of sticking to the rules, following the rules, and making sure that everybody else also follows the rules is the basis of our foreign policy in general. So, and when it comes to cyber and cyber foreign policy, then of course the international law has already set all the principles that all the countries should follow. And I know that when we talk with the lawyers who are not familiar with this cyber lawyer debate, and they are sometimes surprised at home. How can it be that there are some diplomats and lawyers who do not believe that international law should be applied in cyberspace? And we know that it is the truth that as some authoritarian countries, there is a view that we should have some sort of totally new law drawn up for cyber, because the old principles would not apply in this new domain of technology. And I think this is dangerous, because we know that of course, the rationale for those countries might be not so much about the cyberspace and regulation of state behavior, but maybe regulation of how information is shared. And so, in a way, to legitimize the censorship regimes at home, they would like to then see some sort of international treaty so that they can legitimately go on with the censorship efforts. So this is one element. Of course, there is another element of internet governance, as we know. All countries are happy with the internet governance model as we have it, which is a multi-stakeholder model. They would like to put internet under some sort of multilateral heading, and this multilateral heading might mean that we are not losing the interoperable internet as we have it now. So this is another reason, and there are maybe for some other countries there is also the there's a benefit of a doubt that international law might not apply, so that some countries might benefit from the fact that there is not enough clarity about what kind of law applies and how it applies, so that it prolongs the time they or their actors or their criminal actors can actually benefit from the malicious activities in cyberspace. So I think there are many motivations why some countries do believe that international law should be applied in cyberspace. Yeah.
Yes, no, I think I'm struck by, the concern is there's a famous international law, there's a famous case called the Lotus case, which said, what international law does not prohibit, it permits. And so I think that's part of the challenge here, is there's definitely a number of states that do seem to think that if they can, create a zone where international law doesn't prohibit or restrict behavior, that implies that they can, have freedom of maneuverability or freedom of action. And I think that's the interesting thing. So I do think we've, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've largely moved from a conversation about whether international law whole cloth applies to cyberspace to now particular pre-existing rules or doctrines of international law and their applicability. And so you've heard from some circles questions about whether the right of self-defense can be invoked in response to a cyber attack, or whether international humanitarian law, or what we here in the US often call the laws of armed conflict, do they apply to cyber operations? Or even, is there a concept of due diligence in cyberspace? That is, to make sure that your territory is not being used to abuse the rights of others. I guess, you've already kind of opined a little bit about why there might be this divide with certain authoritarian states wanting that freedom to maneuver. but how important do you think it is to bridge that divide? Do we, is the next 5 years is the job to get to some global consensus on international law's application in cyberspace? Or is it more important, for example, that the European Union, the United States and other key states like maybe Brazil or India agree on what international law means? And I don't know that there's a right answer, but I'd be interested if you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, yes, I have thought about it because we are discussing this in the United Nations First Committee now virtually, of course, on daily basis. But I think majority of the countries in the world think that the existing law applies, and they are happy with learning more how this existing law applies. So there are some of them who are still, of course, wanting to maintain this room for maneuvering. And as you said, this has been there since the early debates on cyber issues. But when I look at the UN membership writ large, then I think that almost 85% of the countries actually would like to apply the existing rules and norms, because they also, as Estonia, believe that this protects them in the long run.
Yeah, no, I think one way I've kind of tried to describe some of the debate is, it seems to be a debate about whether we have international law that protects people from states, right, from bad state behavior, or is international law about protecting states from people? And I adhere to the first view a bit more. And I hope you'll forgive me. I would love to, for some of the viewers, this may be a bit new, but for others that are more expert, they might be, they might have some interest. I'm curious to know, as we're seeing debates among the like-minded states, that is, among the Western Europe, states in Europe, states in the United States, Mexico, Israel, and others, we're seeing debates about certain aspects of international law, and I'm wondering how far Estonia has come on that. For example, I know there's a debate among some states about whether due diligence is an obligation of international law that makes sense to apply in cyberspace. That is, that you don't just have to not do things to other states, but you also have to make sure your territory, your networks are not being used to violate other states' international legal rights. Has Estonia formulated a position on due diligence yet? Or is that still something that you're studying?
We have formulated a position which I think was also articulated by our president some time ago when we still had actual conferences. And it says that states have to make reasonable efforts to ensure that the territory is not used to adversely affect the rights of other states. So they should strive to develop means to offer support when requested by the injured state in order to identify, attribute, and investigate malicious cyber operations. And this expectation depends on national capacity as well as availability and accessibility of information. And that's why we always have somehow made a connection between the due diligence and the capacity building, because the due diligence might be frightening for those states who have maybe minimum capacity or no capacity at all. And of course, I think there are all these legal nuances about the due diligence principle applying or not applying. But I think Estonia is somewhere, in the middle when you start asking those nuances. I'm not sure that many people follow those nuances in this audience, but we can have a nice lawyers conversation over coffee the other day. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist, so I should be excused here.
Yeah, no, but I think it's really interesting to have you for the viewers also to see that obviously there's a clear Estonian position there that you were adhering to, and I think is how much the words matter here and how much the particular formulations are important, and one can extrapolate from, say, your response on that. I assume, for example, that Estonia also still supports collective countermeasures. I think I was at a speech given by your president where she articulated that. But I think these particular fine points do matter, because where we start to see agreement, things go forward. So I hope you'll forgive me one more before I let you off the international law hook. I wanted to know about sovereignty. So we've seen a real debate about, first of all, what sovereignty in cyberspace is and what it means. And for some, I think it means, they get to control their own networks and their own people and dictate to them. And for others, it's a line that must not be crossed, in the same way that an airplane, the wingtip goes into another state's airspace, where you say, oh, that violates that state's sovereignty, as opposed to being more just kind of a background principle of the international order. Does Estonia think of sovereignty in cyberspace as kind of a hard rule, like those aircraft wingtips, or is it more of a principle, or as you said on some other things, is Estonia somewhere in between?
In our official position, we are saying that sovereignty entails not only rights but also obligations. States are responsible for the international wrongful cyber operation, just as they would be responsible for any other activity based on international treaties and customary international law. And this is the case whether or not such acts are carried out by state organs or by non-state actors supported or controlled by states. And states cannot waive their responsibility by carrying out malicious cyber operations via non-state actors. If a cyber operation violates international law, this needs to be called out. So we are, as you say, we think it's an important principle in international law, and of course, sovereignty is a bedrock of all other international law, so we cannot easily ignore it.
Yes, and I think I think sovereignty is tremendously important. I think we can also overemphasize it. Like, a lot has been made of the British government, their UK Attorney General, saying that maybe sovereignty is not yet a rule in cyberspace. The US government's been a little bit more circumspect, and while the French and the Dutch have been much more clear about it. But I also think we tend to, maybe we overemphasize, this word, which has different meanings to different people sometimes. So, but I appreciate you at least letting me test the international law questions. But let me turn now, if I can, to cyber norms. First of all, I don't know, maybe for the audience's purposes, if you want to talk a little bit about what is this term? You've used it a couple of times in describing your job and cyber diplomacy. What are cyber norms, and why are they so important to the stability of cyberspace when it comes to state behavior or behavior of state proxies?
Well, we are with cyber norms. We are departing from an understanding that states should agree on those politically agreed norms, which they then should follow, because it is a dual-use domain. That's why the arms control regime, as we have it in other more conventional types of disarmament matters, is very hard to follow in cyberspace. We cannot start verifying all the laptops in the world, whether they have malicious malware somehow directed towards other countries. So therefore, the way to approach cyber stability and to make sure that we are upholding international peace and security in cyberspace is through existing international law. It's a first bedrock. Second, voluntary norms of responsible state behavior, which we have been developing over 10 years in the United Nations First Committee. Third, confidence building measures, and then capacity building measures. And the norms, of course, and confidence building measures and international law are all intertwined a bit. And the norms would be the norms that are driven by international law, and then the self-standing separate norms. There are 11 norms of responsible state behavior as articulated in 2015 UN Group of Governmental Experts report. And this is now the global agreement between, of course, the 20 countries that have been working on those norms. It was endorsed globally by the UN General Assembly in 2015. So therefore, I think we have already some sort of global understanding there, what kind of norms the states should be following. The question, of course, is that not all states follow those norms because they don't think that they should follow. Secondly, not all states can follow those norms because they don't have capacity to have overview of what happens in their cyberspace. And third, there are many states who would like to follow those norms, but they might be not aware that this is important. So I think there are different categories of states, and as the UN membership is very large and consists of many states, we can find very different states there. That some of them are following all those norms every day very diligently, and some of them are ignoring them on purpose. Some of them are not aware of those norms. We are still in a process of mainstreaming these norms, making sure that all the countries who would like to follow those norms can follow those norms.
So I'm curious, you've been doing this a while now. Where do you think on cyber norms we've made the most progress? Is it that we've made progress in getting more states aware of the norms, but we're still struggling with capacity building to get those states to have the capacity? Or like, I guess I'm curious to know where you think, or is it getting more agreement on more specific on what it means to follow these 11 norms that were adopted in 2015 by the group of government experts? Like, or maybe I should ask the broader question, do you see progress, say, from 2015 to 2020, from the announcement of these norms to today?
What actually has been always quite not so understandable for me is that we have those processes at the UN level. We have been agreeing on those norms like 5 years ago. And when we are discussing cyber issues in any cyber conference, there are very few people who have knowledge about those norms. So I think it is a bit of complex topic how the governments agreeing something in a small group under the United Nations one committee have been doing quite useful work, but maybe not having enough capacity to also translate how this normative behavior looks like to a larger public, to the private sector, to the civil society, and also the global community that is dealing with cyber issues. So in a way, we are now in a mainstreaming phase with everything cyber diplomacy related. First international law, secondly norms, then CBMs and so on. So I think this kind of mainstreaming effort is not there yet. We haven't established yet global understanding that so all the actors in cyberspace really understand how to behave, according to international law norms and rules, because international law is setting the first set and primary set of the very important rules and norms. So I think we should follow those first. Like, you as a lawyer, you can name those, but above the threshold, especially, we have to make sure that all the attacks are proportionate, that we do not attack civilian infrastructure, so on and so on. And also below the threshold of armed conflict, we have to make sure that we follow the international law. And the secondary is the norms of responsible state behavior, and then the others. So we have those notions and principles there now for a long time. But the question is how we translate that into cyber. And I think we have to work towards this goal.
Yeah. So one thing I note, though, right, is if one of the challenges is that we need to get the word out, right, we need to mainstream it. Events like this, hopefully, are a useful way. I don't know if anybody, if anybody in the back end can find the 2015 UN GGE norms, but it would be great to post a link in the chat for anybody who's watching that wants to read about those kind of particularly the 11 norms of responsible state behavior that were agreed by the UN group of governmental experts, and then the General Assembly itself has now endorsed. So they are kind of a universally accepted. They're not considered international law, right? They're voluntary, but the idea is that that across the globe, this is something all responsible states should agree to do, as it were.
Yeah. Us follow international law. No, we should not see the norms as separate from the international law.
Yeah.
We should go in together with international law.
Yeah, no, and I think you even said that earlier, that I think these are all intertwined in key ways. I want to make sure we have time for audience questions, but I hope, one of the things we haven't talked about so far is attribution, right? So one of the challenges, in advancing international peace and security is knowing who does what in cyberspace. Do you think we have a good system for attribution in place right now where, we've seen a number of states in the last few years being willing to accuse other states of interference, whether in elections or being responsible for malware like NotPetya or WannaCry, or do we need to do, what more work might we need to do on attribution going forward?
We have done, as you said, great progress actually in advancing our understanding how to do attribution, and many governments have the national attribution procedures in place, which is important. I think because attribution technically only cannot solve our question and cannot give all the answers. And we have to consider all the different elements of attribution. One is technical, then there is political, then there is legal, and then in the end, it is the national sovereign decision by each government whether they would like to publicly attribute or attribute this. Because they might also weigh in other foreign policy aspects there. And it might be that sometimes they want to attribute and sometimes they don't want to attribute. So that's why most of the governments would not accept some third-party organization doing attribution for them. Because if the attribution is only done by the technical measuring of attacks towards some sort of organization, then this actually is not a critical decision there. And the critical decision makes this attribution critically important act. So, and that's why we think that it has to stay the sovereign national decision.
So I'll push back, right? So I think it's a sovereign national decision, but you're not saying, I mean, I assume Estonia is not saying that if a cybersecurity vendor or if a company like Microsoft, who I should disclose I occasionally work with, makes an attribution, they can do it, but it's different when it's done by
it's not called attribution. It shouldn't be called attribution.
Okay.
It is just the technical data about attacks.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, and I'll say Marty Finnemore and I, a political scientist, we actually use the term accusation rather than attribution for similar purposes, right? So from your perspective, attribution is specifically when it is a nation state or a group of nation states saying we know who did this and who was responsible, as they've done with respect to, I think like the UK did with respect to the Russian Federation and the OPCW and the World Anti-Doping Agency being hacked and the like. Okay. I've got like one more quick question before we turn to audience Q&A. How widely shared is the importance of cyber diplomacy outside of Europe, right? Because I think, or the the US and the like. Do you agree at this point that we're ready for a world of not just 20 but 100 cyber diplomats, or do we need to do more things before we can have that sort of world with respect to, say, the global South and other countries?
I think we have to make sure that there are more cyber diplomats, and also in the global South, people who are not just the diplomats but also in a broader cyber community would understand those the national security related questions in cyber, because cyber can be very technical. Cyber can be just about something which is computer science based topic, but here we talk about state behavior and we talk about normative framework for the new era. We are not going back from this digitalized world where we live in. So all institutions, including diplomatic services, should be adapting to this era.
Okay. So, we got about 20 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that the audience has time to pose their own sets of questions. So I'd remind you, please, if you have a question, post it in the chat. I'll try and see if we can't get our ambassador here to give some responses. I note a couple of them I think we've already dealt with. So like the first question was, do we think the general public is aware of the threat of cyber operations? Do you think there needs to be better public messaging? I don't want to put words in your mouth, Heli, but I think you had answered yes, and we need more mainstreaming. But tell me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah, you answered it already. So
yeah. Another question is there, and I've been around diplomats enough to know that you may struggle to answer this question. What is a country that really needs a cyber ambassador but that doesn't have one? And I don't know if you'll name a specific country, but is there a particular type of country that needs a cyber ambassador that doesn't have one yet?
Well, actually, I think that if the question points to the certain large countries with large capacities, they have cyber ambassador. So, but I think what might be the issue for us as a global community here is that there are many countries where civil service has very little understanding what goes on in their own cyberspace, and there is no proper cyber resilience system. So even without countries' government knowing, certain cyber operations can be conducted from their territory. And then there is a question, who do you call or who do you contact there? And I think this is maybe the biggest concern right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So right, because we tend to think of, the diplomats can serve multiple functions, and in addition to mainstreaming issues and working on operationalizing norms, the fact of having a central point of contact in some of these can be quite critical, to know, to be able to have that sort of network.
Yeah, because in confidence building measures, we have different layers of contact points. We have the technical, we have the policy, and then we have high level. All those contact points serve the purpose. And quite often now in cyber, we only have a technical contact points in majority of the countries, but not the decision-making level contact point. And I think this is something that needs to be developed.
Yeah, I think it's a legacy of I think I was, when 10, 15 years ago, when you thought about cyber, it was really something that was done by technical technicians, and the hacker community and internet governance was done by these specialists. And as these issues have become politicized, right, I think there's been a need to bring policymakers and political decision makers into the conversation, that this is no longer an issue that can just be left to be worked out on the back end by really important computer emergency response teams and the like. As important as they are, there's a role for politics here. So there's two questions that take us back to your opening remarks about the national ID and things like internet voting. And so I'm going to phrase them together. So one is that Estonia is a bit famous for its internet voting, and the question here in the U.S., having gone through a recent election, and we have a lot of misinformation going on and disinformation going on right now about the safety and of things like mail-in ballots, but also about the election machines and the voting. One question is, has Estonia found its internet voting safe? And then also with respect to that national ID, in the U.S., civil liberties people worry that a national ID might be a means of suppressing votes. And so the question becomes, how does Estonia ensure that its ID card is not used as a barrier to participation, that people, might resist it and therefore be left out of the processes?
First, physical voting is also possible in Estonia. It's not that we have abolished physical voting. No, I have always voted physically, for instance.
Okay.
So I know I shouldn't say that, but it's true. I want to set the example for my teenage kids how the voting goes, because we have to make sure that the young generation also would take part of the democratic process. So, but e-voting is actually very secure, because it is done in a way that, as all other our government services, you have two-step authentication. So first you have one code of numbers that only you know, it's only issued to you. You have to verify physically in the office that it is you who gets these numbers. So you have a signature 1 and signature 2 that you use electronically when you do more important transactions. And with e-voting, we use this kind of transaction. Of course, there is always a possibility to hack the system and so on, and we pay lots of attention so that the system is not hacked. And there is the data security is protected from the beginning to the end. And also, if people, e-voting is available for 2 weeks before the actual voting date, or depending on the election, and people can always reconsider their vote and discard, and then go and vote physically on the day of elections as well. So if they have I don't know, second thoughts or so on. And also e-voting is mostly used by younger generation, of course, as you can imagine, and also those Estonians living abroad, because they do not want to go to the embassy, stay a very long line. Of course, they can go to embassy, and they can also still vote by mail, or you call it ballot in the US. And there are other options of voting as well. So the e-voting is not the only option. It's far from being the only option. But since we are so used to this using technology for all different services, and for many Estonians, this is just the easier option, and especially if it rains and your kids are crying and they don't want to go anywhere, and so this kind of situation you might have on the voting Sunday. It's always Sunday here.
Yeah, well, for us here, the problem, of course, is that it's not Sunday. It's usually a work day, and we have issues where people are not given time off from work and the like. But the comment about of teenagers and children crying it resonates as I have a few here in the house with me. So I have a question from someone who actually I want to. It goes to your own background, and I regret that we didn't get into it earlier. Is as people with training in law, political science, how did you educate yourself? Like, how did you become an expert on global cybersecurity? Like, are there particular, was it, a particular job, or were there particular texts, particular things you read, or particular things you did that made you, set you out to the foundation that, to get you where you are today as an ambassador for cyber diplomacy?
Well, I should tell you now my war story. So you might know that Estonia was the first nation that has experienced large-scale cyber attacks in 2007. Yeah. So I happened to be the person who was tasked to put together the national cyber strategy after those attacks. So so I was working for the Ministry of Defense, and I had been working with NATO, international security, international security policy issues before, and cyber was certainly new for me. And so the working group I was heading consisted of technology experts and cyber experts. And so I was the only non-cyber person or non-technology person, I think, there, because the understanding was that cyber is so technical, so it has to be dealt with technical people. Soon I realized that it is very strategic, and well, somehow after this 2007 event, I have stayed in cyber. But of course, my training was to sit with those best experts in your country, that are technical experts, in the same room every day, and draft the national strategy. And this is my cyber training. Well, believe me, it's much harder than any university. So.
Yeah, I mean, as I tell students, like, there was a time when you couldn't study cybersecurity or cyber law and policy and the like, and you kind of had to learn it as you go. And so it's great to hear, like, as you say, the war story of how you can have this one background, but then be brought into a technical context and see the linkages between the two. I had one question from Mari, asks if we can clarify the accusation versus the attribution distinction. I'm happy to do so unless you wanted to take a shot, because I think we don't want to confuse the audience in terms of what's the difference between, as you understand, an attribution and then these things that, say, a CrowdStrike or a FireEye or a Microsoft might do.
Of course, we shouldn't confuse the people watching this conversation, but I think it is important to remember that according to international law, and of course you should know it because you are the lawyer, attribution has very specific meaning. So, and attribution is an act done by a nation state. So, and CrowdStrike is a very important player in this ecosystem, but it is not a nation state, so you cannot call it properly attribution. But of course, I think in our community language, we call this attribution as well. But as I explained earlier, when the government attributes something, it also considers other aspects than technical cyber data. And therefore, attribution is always political decision.
Yeah, I think, I liken it to the term cyber attack. So for, reading the Financial Times or whatever, you see the term cyber attack used all the time. But for international lawyers, for example, that term has a very precise meaning, and it usually involves being above the use of force threshold. So I think, one of the challenges to this space is that we have a kind of colloquial language that gets used that was developed, by the private sector and the like, and, crafted this term. But then when we bring it into conversations about international law or norms, we have to always be very careful of whether we're using the term colloquially, right, in its kind of general usage, or as a term of art. And I do agree that there is, it is significant that when a state accuses another state of being responsible, that there are political, legal, and technical decisions that go into that sort of attribution that separate it out from, say, an accusation like Microsoft made last week that certain state actors are trying to, steal vaccine research or the like. I think they're both important and they both warrant attention, but the Microsoft isn't going to trigger questions of international law or the possibility that the accusing state might engage in countermeasures, right? Which is, this idea in international law that you can do something that's unlawful if it's in response to some other states' unlawful behavior, right? A kind of a tit for tat sort of response. Thinking about the Microsofts or the CrowdStrikes of the world, can you talk a little bit about how the cyber diplomacy portfolio might be different from, say, the arms control Diplomat or the like? I see some questions here about whether, as a cyber ambassador, do you think you have more interactions with the private sector than normal ambassadors? And what is that like?
I think it is true that we are also interacting with the private sector and civil society on daily basis, which is not usually maybe bread and butter of a traditional geographic ambassador who would be residing in a certain capital and talking to the government of the capital most of the time. So we are, first of all, we are operating globally. So there is no one place we operate. So we go to conferences, we have meetings in the UN and so on. This is where we meet. Secondly, we really reach out to the private sector on daily basis, either on the national level to discuss the national cyber issues, or also the global level to discuss the more global topics. And we are, as you know, of course, all these cyber conferences usually are made up from the government, from the private sector and civil society and academia. So it's a very interesting community in a way. It's not. I shouldn't say just a boring government people, but in a way, it is much more interesting than being just a traditional civil servant.
So actually, and this dovetails really nicely with a question, and I'd be interested, I have an answer for myself, but I wonder for you, the question is, one would think that cyber diplomacy had no problem moving online during the pandemic, but have you found that there have been downsides in not being able to have cyber dialogues and discussions in person? So does cyber diplomacy need real world interactions, do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Because all the diplomacy is done by people. So, and people need to talk to the people. We need to have coffee in UN corridors and exchange some information. And also, as our colleagues are changing in different capitals. So I have interesting experience of getting to know some of my fellow ambassadors via Zoom or via Webex, or and it works, yes. But still, you would like to see the person in person too.
Yeah, no, I have to agree. As someone, I feel like, sometimes there might have been too much travel before the pandemic, but certainly, there is something about having that coffee or having that meal and having face-to-face discussions, and the communication, as we all know. As a professor, I certainly know in trying to teach students, the communication is okay, but it's not as effective as what can be conveyed in a real person meeting. So, I'm looking at the time and, we only have a few minutes left, but I kind of wonder if I might, take the moderators or the interviewer's prerogative and ask you about the UN and its future, right? So you've been in the fortunate position to be on the group of government experts. You're aware of there's another parallel UN process, the open-ended working group. There's also activity on maybe a UN cybercrime convention. Where do you see the United Nations fitting into cyber diplomacy in the future? Do you have any predictions for where we go next after this current round of GGE and open-ended working groups, wrap up? What's the future hold as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think, first of all, of course, the UN has a role in the cyber discussions because it is the only global organization and the whole domain is global. So we have to have a global consensus and global understanding. Secondly, what UN can do more. I think we have seen the UN being quite active as we have discussed the first committee reports and so on. But now the open-ended working group is a broad group where all 193 countries are participating. Not all are participating, but they are at least having invited to participate. And And we see currently a lot of mainstreaming, I think, in terms of countries studying first time what are those international law principles that should be applying, what are the cyber norms, and so on. So in a way, it's a very positive that we have that process going on globally. At the same time, what we lack a bit in this UN First Committee setting is, of course, the view of multi-stakeholder community or the private sector or civil society. So in a way, we have ended up with government-to-government discussion only in the United Nations, with very little input from the other stakeholders. And this might be something that in the long run is not very productive, right? So we have to see whether there is a possible to set up a mechanism where we also can consult more with the actual players in cyberspace, which would be the private sector and civil society. And we already have one proposal on the table in the first committee. And hopefully this proposal will be then considered by majority of the first committee open-ended working group countries to be taken into account and have some other process and mechanism of how we are actually implementing those norms and how we bring in the multi-stakeholder community into this field. So I hope that this will be materializing by the end of this year. And I hope that the program of action that is proposed now in the first committee is going to work for us.
Is
of course,
Estonia, is Estonia, are you one of the co-sponsors of the program of
yes,
action?
we are one of the co-sponsors, as all the European Union member states are.
Yeah.
And so hopefully then this will be the kind of way forward. And of course, we see a bit too much activity in different committees. So the question would be like, yes, we cannot of course stop those activities, but how we steer those activities in a way that it will be added value by the United Nations.
So it sounds like, you know, that there's you have a bit of hope in there in terms of that there's ways forward in terms of constructive dialogue, and that you know, and you know, sometimes diplomats are treated as very reserved and careful, and I appreciate, you know, you don't want to make news on these interviews, but it does sound to me like that there's a bit of optimism there that further dialogue is both possible and necessary in this space.
Yeah, there is but it is all now changing quite quickly, and we have not reached the end of the first open-ended working group yet. So I think it's too early to tell. Once we see the final report of the open-ended working group, which should be there by March 2021, then we can say for sure that we have now the way forward.
Well, look, I think you've given readers, you know, I think they did post the GGE norms in the chat, and now viewers who are interested in following the space now have a date to look forward to, both for the open-ended working group report and then the eventual GGE report. You know, we'll be able to mark progress through those kind of developments in the UN setting. But you've got I hope people have gotten a larger sense of the importance of international law, norms, confidence building measures in this space, and the importance of cyber diplomacy and cyber diplomats. So I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. So I want to personally thank you, Heli. It's always a pleasure to see you, whether in person or virtually, and it's been a great conversation. And Mike, I'll turn it over to you if you have any last minute thoughts or words.
Absolutely. I mean, thanks to both of you. This was an incredibly interesting conversation. You know, it's an honor to have you as a visiting fellow ambassador, and you know, Duncan, it's great to have you back at Perry Worldhouse. And, you know, hopefully we can have you both here actually in person, you know, in the future when it's possible to do those sorts of things again. And for our audience, you know, thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you on Thursday for our next event, a discussion on China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, a book by Dan Markey, or next week for The World Today, featuring Marvin Rees, Mayor of Bristol. More information on all of those and links to register are in the chat. You can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel and find out about all of our other upcoming events. You can also follow us on social media, Instagram or Twitter at Perry Worldhouse. Thank you again, Ambassador. Thank you, Duncan. This was a super interesting conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I hope everybody has a great day.